So politics and US elections in general typically don't have much of a medium to long-term impact on markets. What we find is that there are other types of policies that have a more profound impact on markets. First, it's general tax policy. So what are the US tax rates? How are they shifting things like capital gains tax rates over time? Those have a greater impact than pure politics or rhetoric. The second piece is the Federal Reserve's interest rate policy. So how the Federal Reserve is manipulating interest rates up or down is more impactful on company earnings and how we project those company earnings into the future, which is then reflected in a company's stock price. So overall, politics is only very impactful on medium to long-term market returns when one important thing happens in US elections, and typically in US presidential election cycles. It's when the US president, when the Senate and the House are all controlled by the same party. And the reason that's important is then the president and their policy can actually be pushed through Congress. So the president's platform can actually be implemented. Other than that, when you're looking at an election cycle, much of the rhetoric is just that. It's ideas that may or may not be implemented over time. So while they might scare the markets over the medium to long term, unless they're implemented, they're not actually impactful. And usually it's tax policy that drives that. It can impact an American overseas actually in a few unique and particular ways. The first is more general. So obviously an American that has their 401k or IRA or Roth or some type of investment account invested in the US will feel stock market returns, right? Or bond market returns. They're going to feel those no matter if the changes are based on tax policy or interest rate policy. But more broadly, tax policy in the US is important to an American living abroad because US citizens and green card holders are still liable to pay US taxes. So what happens back home still matters to us. And there are some places where different politicians are lobbying to repeal citizenship-based taxation. That's something that's been in the news really over the last decade. Different groups are trying to lobby for that. Pretty unsuccessfully, I might add, up until this point. But unless that changes, it's not really going to change the overall picture for Americans that live abroad. Trump wins the election, and the Republican platform around tax policy and the economy gets implemented. So what we really have to remember when we think back to the previous Trump presidency is the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act is one of his landmark pieces of legislation. And that is actually due to expire at the end of 2025. It has a couple of really important pieces in it. Not only was it a tax cut, but it actually made the federal estate tax exemption double. So that went from about 5 million at the time to about 10 million. With inflation, it's now about 13 million per person. That's due to sunset. The tax cuts that he implemented are due to sunset. So US tax rates would go higher when that sunsets. Trump, this being his landmark piece of legislation, is likely going to want to extend that and make the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act permanent. So I think that's the first thing to really watch out for. The second is a lot of people are concerned around what tariffs might be implemented, and actually just the overall combative nature of a Trump administration on global trade. Trump was remarkably tough on China in his first term, and actually Biden has continued that kind of a little bit underneath the surface, continuing this tough Chinese trade policy. I think from a European perspective, most people would be really worried about Trump opening up more combative trade barriers and more combative trade rhetoric with the EU in general. So I think that's something to watch out for, which then the US consumer is worried about more expensive goods. The US imports a lot already. They already have much higher inflation than you've experienced in much of the developed world. So the US consumer would potentially be worried about increased costs. Now that might be offset by an extension of the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act. So it's really with Trump, the market does like Republicans. The market likes Republicans because of tax policy in general. A lot of the big institutional investors like Republicans because of that tax policy, because of there's not a lot of corporate or environmental governance that comes along with the Republican administration. So at surface level, historically, most people have thought of Republicans as being good for the market for all those reasons that we mentioned. So I think a Trump administration might accelerate it, because what we've seen is some Americans that were considering a life abroad are really getting a push from the fragmented political scene and all of the negative political rhetoric in the US. In the US, the 24-hour news cycle is really exhausting, so people are just kind of looking to escape that, particularly in later life, early retirement years. Also, places like France and Spain are far more affordable than most American big cities, so people are retiring because they can have a better quality of life, not worry about money as much. Spain actually, from a tax perspective, is very difficult for Americans. Spanish taxes are much higher than most US taxes, and in most states, even a high tax state like California. Spain might be equitable or actually have higher tax rates than California. So that's something to really watch out for. France is really the hidden gem in all of this. France and the US have one of the strongest double taxation agreements for American retirees. Many American retirees, and even some people that are working, can move to France, and by virtue of the double taxation agreement, they really end up only paying taxes to the US, and they get an equivalent French tax credit. So France, while it's not really that widely known, offers plenty of tax benefits for retiring Americans. So Americans recently have started moving more and more to Europe, and I think a lot of that's just based on a variety of factors, but a few key ones. One is the quality of life. So now in the US, we hear a lot on the news about kind of the level of dysfunction that exists in society. There's been quite a lot of violence and gun violence and mass shootings lately in the US. The 24-hour news cycle has really worn people down, and what people are looking for, particularly if they're looking to move and raise a young family, or those that are looking for just kind of a more calm, serene environment in retirement, is they're looking for a place where it's a little bit less confrontational. They can get on with their lives and not worry about their personal safety. They're also looking for a place that's a little bit more affordable. Over the last 20 years, the disparity in inflation and just the price of living in the US and Europe has really grown. There's a massive difference now between living in New York and living in Paris. And 20 years ago, due to the exchange rate and other factors, that might not have been the case. But now New York is far more expensive than even the biggest cities in Europe. And I think Americans who have, they've gotten used to a certain quality of life, but they've also worked really hard and amassed usually a pretty big pension pot, or their house has really grown in value, are now looking at the money that they've saved and how hard they've worked over time, and seeing that that's not going to be enough for a comfortable retirement in the US anymore. And a lot of people aren't feeling like they have the opportunity to retire at 55, 60, or 65 in the US, but they might be able to in Europe. They should be able to in a place like Portugal, a place like Spain or Italy, that has a much lower cost of living than the US. So people are looking at their personal safety, the quality of life, affordability, and then when you add on top of that all of the really cool factors like the different cuisines, the different cultures, the fact that you can fly from Milan to Paris in an hour and 20 minutes and be in a completely different culture surrounded by all of this history, that's really attractive to Americans. We previously retired much more in places like Mexico or Costa Rica or Ecuador, which are great options as well. But now that people are seeing that Europe isn't that expensive and there's all the history and culture, they're really attracted to that too.